Thousands of men lay screaming for water under the July sun. They had been shot, bayoneted, or torn by artillery on the fields around Gettysburg. When the guns finally stopped on July 3, 1863, the two armies did something few people today realize. They largely abandoned their wounded where they fell. For days afterward, those soldiers suffered in agony with almost no help. Many died slowly from thirst, infection, and exposure before anyone reached them. That grim reality is what really happened to the wounded after Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg produced more casualties than any other fight in American history. Over 51,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing in just 3 days. Roughly 14,500 Union soldiers and 18,700 Confederates suffered wounds. Many of those injuries were horrific. Minié-balls shattered bones. Artillery shells ripped off limbs. Bayonets and rifle butts left deep gashes. In the chaos of the final day, both sides pulled back. They left thousands of their own men behind on the open ground. The hot Pennsylvania sun beat down. There was little water. The cries for help went unanswered for hours and then for days. General Robert E. Lee knew he had to retreat. His army was battered and supplies were low. On the night of July 4th, his forces began pulling out in heavy rain. Lee took as many wounded as he could fit into a 17-mile-long wagon train. That miserable procession became known as Imboden's Train of Misery. Roughly 8,000 Confederate wounded who could travel went with it. The journey south was pure torment. Wagons had no springs. Rain poured down. Men with shattered legs and bleeding wounds bounced for miles. Some died along the road. Others were left behind when wagons broke down. Local civilians attacked parts of the train with axes and clubs. The suffering was extreme. But the greater horror stayed behind in Gettysburg. Over 6,800 Confederate wounded were too badly hurt to move. They fell into Union hands. At the same time, thousands of Union wounded still lay scattered across farms and fields. The small town of Gettysburg had only about 2,400 residents. Suddenly, it faced more than 20,000 wounded and dying men. Every house, barn, church, school, and shop became a hospital. Surgeons worked without rest. They performed amputations on kitchen tables and barn floors. There was almost no anesthesia for most men. The screams echoed through the streets for weeks. Many soldiers never made it to any hospital. They lay where they fell for 1, 2, or even 3 days. Some had been hit on July 1st and were still waiting when the battle ended on the 3rd. They called out for water until their voices gave out. Their wounds swelled in the heat. Infection set in fast. Gangrene spread through torn flesh. Men watched their own limbs turn black. Others simply bled to death slowly because no one reached them in time. Union burial details and civilian volunteers eventually began collecting the living and the dead. But for thousands, the help came far too late. The scale overwhelmed everyone. The United States Sanitary Commission sent nurses and supplies. Local women turned their homes into wards. Yet even with the best efforts available in 1863, care was primitive. Doctors amputated limbs to stop infection. They had no antibiotics. They had limited pain relief. Many men who survived the initial wounds later died from blood poisoning or fever in the crowded hospitals. The last wounded soldiers did not leave Gettysburg until January of 1864. By then, the fields and barns had witnessed months of unimaginable suffering. The days after the guns fell silent were worse than the battle itself for thousands of men. Wounded soldiers lay scattered across the fields and woods around Gettysburg. Some had been hit on the first day and were still waiting when the fighting ended on the 3rd. They called out for water until their voices failed. The July sun baked their torn bodies. Wounds swelled and turned black with gangrene. Infection spread through blood and tissue with nothing to stop it. Many men simply died where they fell because no one could reach them in time. The armies had moved on. Help came slowly and in small numbers at first. Union burial parties and local civilians eventually began the grim work of collecting the living and the dead. They found men who had lain for 2 or 3 days without food or water. Some had dragged themselves to nearby streams, only to find the water fouled by blood and bodies. Others had been stripped of their shoes and canteens by desperate comrades or looters. The heat made everything worse. Bodies bloated in the sun. The smell of death hung over the town and farms for weeks. Gettysburg's 2,400 residents suddenly faced more wounded men than they had people. Every available building became a hospital ward. Surgeons worked without rest in homes, barns, churches, and schools. They performed hundreds of amputations on kitchen tables and barn floors. There was rarely enough chloroform or ether. Many men endured the saw and knife while fully awake. The screams carried through open windows into the streets. Doctors did what they could with the tools of 1863. They cut away shattered limbs to stop gangrene. They cleaned wounds as best they could. But infection was everywhere. Hundreds of soldiers who survived the initial trauma later died from blood poisoning or fever in those crowded makeshift hospitals. The Union Army eventually organized better care. In mid-July, they established Camp Letterman, a large tent hospital along the York Pike east of town. It became the main facility for men too badly wounded to travel. Over 100 surgeons stayed behind to work there. Nurses from the United States Sanitary Commission arrived to help. These women brought clean bandages, better food, and basic comfort to men who had known almost none. The camp operated for months. The last wounded soldiers did not leave Gettysburg until January of 1864. By then, the fields had been cleared and most of the temporary hospitals had closed. But the human cost remained. Confederate wounded faced an even harsher fate. More than 6,800 of them had been left behind when Lee retreated. They fell into Union hands and were treated in the same overwhelmed hospitals as their enemies. Some received decent care. Others were simply too numerous for the system to handle properly. A few were eventually exchanged or paroled. Many more died far from home in strange beds surrounded by strangers. The long wagon train that carried the fitter Confederate wounded south became its own nightmare. Men with fresh amputations and bullet wounds bounced over rough roads in open wagons during days of rain. Some died along the way. Others were left beside the road when wagons broke down. The stories from those weeks are filled with quiet horror. One Union soldier described lying wounded for 2 days while artillery shells still burst nearby. Another wrote of watching his own leg turn black and feeling the fever climb until he could no longer think clearly. Civilians who volunteered in the hospitals later spoke of the endless rows of suffering men and the smell that never left their clothes. Surgeons wrote of working until they could no longer stand, then sleeping a few hours on the floor before returning to the saw and the knife. The battle had ended. The dying continued for months. The long-term fate of the wounded after Gettysburg reveals the true cost of the battle in ways the famous 3 days never could. Hundreds of men who survived the initial fighting died in the weeks and months that followed. Infection, gangrene, and fever claimed them in crowded hospitals and makeshift wards. Some lingered for days in terrible pain. Others lasted weeks before their bodies finally gave out. The official records show that many more soldiers died from their wounds after the battle than during the fighting itself. Gettysburg did not end when the last shot was fired. For the wounded, it had only begun. Those who lived often faced a lifetime of suffering. Thousands of amputees returned home with empty sleeves or missing legs. They struggled to work, to support their families, and to find any sense of normal life. In an era with almost no modern prosthetics or pain management, many endured constant discomfort. Chronic infections flared up years later. Some men lived with bullets or fragments still inside their bodies. The psychological wounds were just as real. Nightmares, anxiety, and the haunting memory of the field hospitals stayed with them long after the physical scars had healed. Families bore the burden too. Wives and children cared for disabled veterans with little outside help. Communities tried to provide support, but the sheer number of broken men overwhelmed the systems of the time. The story of what happened to the soldiers left wounded after Gettysburg is not one of quick recovery or heroic survival. It is a story of prolonged agony, quiet endurance, and lives permanently altered. The dramatic charges and desperate stands on the battlefield have been told countless times. Far less attention has been given to the men who lay in barns and churches for months afterward, fighting a slower and often more hopeless battle against infection and despair. Those weeks and months of suffering deserve to be remembered alongside the famous fighting. They show the real human price of war in ways no map or casualty count can capture. Today, Gettysburg is remembered as the turning point of the Civil War. The fields are peaceful. The monuments stand in quiet rows. Visitors walk the ground where so much blood was spilled. But the story of the wounded left behind adds a necessary layer of truth. It reminds us that battles do not end when the armies move on. The suffering continues in hospitals and homes, in broken bodies and shattered lives. The men who called for water on those hot July fields, who endured the saw without enough anesthesia, and who later faced life with missing limbs or constant pain, are part of Gettysburg's full story. Their experience was worse than most people realize. It was slower, more personal, and far more devastating than the dramatic hours of combat. The final truth is simple. Gettysburg was not just a 3-day battle. It was a months-long ordeal for thousands of wounded soldiers who were left behind. Some died in agony. Others survived but never truly recovered. Their stories deserve to be told because they reveal what war actually does to human beings, long after the flags have been furled and the guns have gone silent. The men left wounded after Gettysburg paid a price that lasted the rest of their lives. Remembering them means remembering the full cost of that terrible summer in Pennsylvania. If you want more untold stories about the hidden suffering, courage, and long shadows of the Civil War, be sure to subscribe. New videos drop every week.